The death of Robin Williams has sparked a lot of discussion on the internet, and actually several of the people I've known have asked me questions specifically about whether or not his suicide was a selfish thing, whether or not suicide in general is selfish, whether or not he had a choice. But before I go further, I'd like to distinguish myself as a member of one of his beloved fans from somebody who had a real relationship with him, which is Robin Williams didn't owe me, Joe Public, anything. I was looking forward to his next bit of wonderful entertainment. I'm very disappointed that there's not going to be one now, but he could have simply retired and that'd be the end of it, and I would have no say in that. So if his act was selfish, it's not to me, who might imagine I have a relationship with him, but I really don't. It's to the people who, from the perspective of the people who actually had relationships with him, his children, his wife, and even his ex-wives. Then, of course, I think the question is, why am I discussing this? Why don't I leave it alone? Well, Robin Williams was a beloved public character. A lot of people, did care about him, and his death is an opportunity to discuss one of our society's biggest killers, particularly among certain demographics. It's one of the top killers of young people. It is the top killer of people in the military or veterans. Young veterans as well. It is the number one killer for those people. It is suicide and depression. So, if we can prevent suicides by holding Robin Williams accountable, then I'm all for it. You can't argue that humans have just blanket free will. Our free will might exist, but it is always limited by our ability to see choices and our ability to predict the future, which we're not very good at. In certain circumstances, we're awesome at it, but very often we're not. Then, of course, you have the effect of a mental illness like depression, and that does change our free will quite a bit, and there's articles written on this. So we can say that in the case of Robin Williams, even though he wasn't diagnosed with depression, that have no real reason to believe he wasn't in a state of depression when he killed himself. That's almost always the case, and that was seriously affecting the amount of free will he had. One of the common misconceptions about depression is it's about sadness. It's not, it's about misery. And this misery comes in sadness. That flavor comes in the flavor of a lot of guilt, which is very clear from watching interviews of Robin Williams and things like that he had a lot of guilt. And it comes in the flavor of hopelessness and often anger. Those are the major flavors that people report and feel. The fifth one is numbness, feeling nothing. So if you've got a mental illness that by definition makes you feel hopeless, then that really twists your ability to predict the future, and that affects your free will. However, there was a choice he made clearly that could have been done differently in any case, and that is the choice not to get help. He identified himself as someone who struggles with depression years before this. And the only thing he ever sought psychological help for, as far as I can tell, is his addiction problems. And that choice not to seek help is, I think, something we might be able to hold him accountable for. So I'd like to talk about why he may not have done this. And there's some three good opportunities here to, I think, educate the public on the barriers for getting psychological help and thus preventing suicides. And the first one, I think, is the difficulty in diagnosing the condition, the mental illness that Robin Williams suffered from. Because I don't think it was depression. I think he was bipolar. And he exhibited some of the clear signs that I would like to educate people on what bipolar is. Bipolar disorder is one of the most misdiagnosed, most underdiagnosed mental illness there is. And the reason for that is a big reason why he may not have gotten some help for it, which is they're not depressed for that long. They have periods where they're not depressed at all. In fact, they have the opposite problem. And they're in states of significantly poor moods for such a brief time that they're less likely to break down and see a therapist. When they do see a therapist, the therapist sees depression. They don't know about the period before that when they weren't depressed, and so the therapist has a hard time without input from the family and things like that, the other side of the problem. So let's talk about some of the signs I recognized in Robin as far as bipolar disorder. A couple of things that really stand out. I think anybody who's seen him perform and things will note that there was some significant differences in appearances and interviews and performances he would give in terms of level of energy. But the main thing that I focus on is rate of speech. His speech sometimes was very calm, relaxed, and relatively slow, and then particularly when he was in quite a bit more animated, his rate of speech went up really high. Couple that with somebody who struggles with depression, and you really get the feeling that there's a manic period there. Then, of course, his talking about guilt not only suggests depression, and people who are depressed have guilt all out of proportion to what they should. This is a sign that family members and friends can recognize. If the person's guilt seems out of proportion to what you would think it is, obviously if you're the victim of what they've done wrong and you think their guilt is out of proportion, then it's a great sign that somebody might be struggling with depressive episodes. But then the periods we call manic periods, where they're really up, they're talking very fast, they often exhibit very poor judgment, which leads to mistakes that during the depression phase they really hammered themselves over.
Spending too much money and such.
Too much money, infidelity, going on, flaking out on responsibilities, that kind of thing. Yes.
Watching Jersey Shore.
I think Robin Williams would have said making Bicentennial Man. Although I personally love the movie, but and this is one of the things with depression, though, is, and particularly guilt, people don't recognize this as a sign of mental illness, and also it's really easy for somebody suffering from periods of being manic to see their poor judgment during the manic phase as a moral failing, and you would go for that to some kind of priest or clergy, if anybody at all, rather than a therapist to help resolve that. The idea that making poor decisions is a mental health issue is not generally what you would think of, unless somebody is really crazy, and that's not, I think Robin Williams is a great example of how much fun, how valuable somebody who suffers from manic periods can be, but also how they're not what we think of when we say crazy. They might need some help protecting themselves from themselves just a little bit. I think Robin Williams had trouble going to a therapist for his depression based on the barriers that a lot of people have with getting help. People think of it almost like they think of an invasive surgery. I think, or maybe even a trip to the dentist. It's often perceived as a uncomfortable experience. There's a joke, how many psychiatrists does it take to change a light bulb? One, but it's really got to want to change. And I think the perception out there that is true, very true for addictions, particularly where you have somebody suffering from mental illness that really has trouble wanting to change. That's the real issue there. And I think that's transferred over onto other things, of how much work and how much personal investment is in changing the changes that would be necessary to help recover from depressive and mood disorders. There's some truth in all of that. People realize that they're going to need their appendix out, for instance, and there's it is a surgery where you open up the body, and that's a scary thing, but people realize that their life is at stake there. Or even if it's plastic surgery, they're going to get something they really want out of it in that case. And I don't think that realization and is there. When people decide not to go to therapy, they don't realize that really might end up in their death and their suicide, that decision. And that goes back to what I was saying. Sometimes we're not very good at predicting the future. Another thing I forgot to mention about bipolar disorder, one of the reasons why it kind of sneaks up on people, is each depressive phase has an accumulated risk of suicide. Because on the upswing, that they're able to tell themselves, I'm over it, that's never going to happen again. But when they're in the middle of a depressive phase and it happens a couple of times a year, every single year, they might realize that they can make it through this one, but the thinking is, I can't do this again. And there are always life's little tragedies, and it's guaranteed with somebody with a significant case of bipolar disorder, because the little tragedies are caused by their poor decision 2 weeks ago when they were in their manic phase. So it's almost often time to hit right when it would hurt the most. The consequences of their not being as responsible as they usually are. I think recognizing that the guilt, the general misery, whatever it looks like, anger, all of those things are actually signs of a mental illness, along with why we're feeling guilty, the poor judgment during our more animated times when we're talking really fast. That could really have prevented this tragedy by saying, hey, maybe the solution to these problems aren't better moral fiber, but a trip to a therapist and maybe some kind of doctor, such as a psychiatrist, that can give you some mood stabilizing medication. I've covered the first two reasons now. The difficulty of recognizing the signs of the mental illness that he was suffering from, whether it's depression or some other mood disorder. The realization that going in and seeing a therapist, it might be a little uncomfortable in some ways, and blowing that out of proportion to at least some degree, because it's not as bad when as far as really wanting to change and that kind of thing. It's much more gentle of a procedure when you're talking about a mood disorder versus an addictive disorder. The surgery is much less invasive, more like tonsillitis, getting your tonsils out, than major open heart surgery, for instance. And the third one is straight up the stigma on mental illness. And I think this is one area that we can really give Robin Williams a break in that he was a public figure. You knew that the paparazzi and the media would comment on it. If he was going to see a therapist for something, he'd probably have to think of how to spin it. And I think that's one of the reasons why he's been diagnosed with a substance abuse disorder. That's a dime a dozen among celebrities and in Hollywood, whereas other kinds of mental health problems, particularly ones that would include what we call, scary terms like a manic state. If he suspected that he might suffer from them, he might have real reason to avoid getting diagnosed with bipolar disorder. But one thing that the public ought to know is they have the right not to be diagnosed with an illness. They can go to their psychiatrist and their therapist and say, I don't want an official diagnosis. Treat me for whatever you think I have, but keep it to yourself. While Robin Williams has a greater excuse not to go to a therapist, there's no seeing a therapist without a risk of your close friends and family finding out. And that's where we need to really change the stigma on mental illness. It's sad that Robin Williams has that excuse, or anyone has that excuse. And really no one I've seen has been, why didn't he go to therapy? Why did he choose to kill himself? Not why didn't he go to therapy? And I think when we ask that question, we can be a lot more compassionate toward Robin Williams, no matter how hurt we might feel, being in his personal life, or because we can answer that question. We can say, hey, there are some good reasons why he didn't go to therapy, but I don't think any of them were good enough to lose him. And it's just sad that when he made that decision, he didn't see that it would result in his death. Maybe they are good enough. Maybe the stigma on mental illness is so bad that it would be better for some people to die than risk the problems that can arise from it. And that's the fact that argument could even be entertained is really sad. The question isn't whether or not Robin Williams chose or was selfish in his suicide. It's whether or not it was justified that he chose not to get therapy. Deaths like Robin Williams's could be prevented by greater understanding of the signs of mental illness. It's important to have courage in combating the stigma on mental illness, but it's just as important to educate yourself about mental health issues.